The air in the dealership was conditioned sterile, but it did nothing to cool the sudden chill that spread through my veins. The man Mark from Riverside Auto Group leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a secret too heavy for the ordinary hum of commerce. Ma'am, your father didn't just leave a car. You need to see what he left inside. My fingers, already cold, tightened their grip on the smooth, polished edge of the counter. A wave of sick dread washed over me. By then, it was too late. The car was already gone sold, erased as if its 20 years of history, its deep, quiet meaning, had amounted to nothing. And yet somehow, my father, even from beyond, still seemed to command the last word. Just 6 days earlier, I had stood in the driveway of our family home, a stark, empty canvas where the faded navy blue Mustang had always sat a steadfast sentinel for 2 decades. The silence was not merely quiet. It was a vast, aching hollow, as if a vital organ had been torn from the very heart of the house, not just the garage. I had only recently returned from a 6-month deployment. Nothing dramatic this time, no combat zones, no extreme danger, just the monotonous grind of logistic support, endless hours, and the insidious routine stress that slowly leaches the color from life. It was enough, though, to make you ache for the small familiar comforts, a scalding hot shower in your own bathroom, coffee that didn't taste of burnt metal and stale filters. And for me, that car, my dad's Mustang, was the ultimate anchor. It had never been flashy, never needed to be. Its deep navy paint, worn just enough to hint at its venerable age, without ever losing its inherent dignity, spoke volumes. My father used to run his hand along its hood, a gesture of quiet reverence, and say, "A car is like a man, Emily. You take care of it, it'll carry you through anything." And it had. That Mustang had been more than just transportation. It was a silent witness to our lives. It carried him through my boisterous childhood, through the strained, awkward silence of my teenage years, when words between us were scarce, through the quiet, heartbreaking decline of my mother's illness, through his retirement, a time when most men his age eased up, slowed down. But he never truly did. 20 years his hands steady on that wheel, the world passing by in the rearview mirror. Then, one quiet afternoon, about a year before he passed, it became mine. Not in a formal ceremony, no grand gesture, just a simple exchange in the echoing space of the garage. He had pressed the cool, heavy keys into my palm. "Take it," he said, his gaze steady. "You'll understand someday." That was my dad, a former Navy SEAL, a man whose words were few, but when he spoke, you listened. Growing up, he hadn't regaled us with dramatic tales of service, no boastful war stories. Instead, he distilled his wisdom into quiet lessons, carved as deeply as the creases in his uniform. Finish what you start, don't cut corners, and never ever take something that isn't yours, even if no one's watching. He lived by a stringent code of ownership and responsibility, which was precisely why standing in that empty driveway, staring at the void where the Mustang had been, felt like so much more than mere loss. It felt like something fundamental had been shattered. I walked inside the familiar coolness of the house, doing little to calm my churning stomach. Dropping my deployment bag by the door, with a dull thud, I found my brother Alex in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, absorbed in his phone, scrolling with a casual indifference that screamed of just another ordinary day. "Where's the Mustang?" I asked, the words feeling brittle in my throat. He didn't even look up right away. That should have been my first warning. The premonition of something deeply unsettling began to prickle at the back of my neck. Finally, with a languid shrug, he glanced up, his expression as nonchalant as if I'd asked about a misplaced kitchen chair. "Yeah, I sold it." I blinked, the world momentarily blurring at the edges. "You what?" Now he looked at me fully, his eyes devoid of guilt, his face betraying no hesitation. "Sold it. Got 80 grand for it. Not bad, right?" For a disorienting moment, I thought I'd misheard him, that my brain simply couldn't process the absurdity of what he was saying. The words hung in the air, a physical weight between us. "That wasn't yours to sell." He let out a long-suffering sigh, the kind that implied I was the unreasonable one. Relax. Relax. It's just a car." Just a car. The words were a physical blow. I felt something cold and hard tighten in my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. "That was Dad's car. And now it's cash." He shot back, his voice rising slightly, which I needed. "For what?" He hesitated just long enough for the pause to be noticeable, a chink in his otherwise seamless facade. "Wedding stuff. Bills. Life." Life? he said, as if that singular word uttered with a dismissive wave of his hand was a blanket explanation for everything. My brother Alex and I had always been polar opposites. Where I sought structure and routine, he chafed against it. Where I aimed for steady ground, he perpetually drifted. Jobs came and went like summer rain. Plans materialized, only to dissolve into mist. Money seemed to slip through his fingers as if it held no tangible value. But this wasn't just another casual bad decision. This felt like a deliberate, unforgivable crossing of a line. "Did you even think to call me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He rolled his eyes, a familiar gesture of dismissiveness. "You were deployed. What was I supposed to do?" "Wait 6 months." "Yes," I said quietly, firmly. "You were." He laughed then, a short, sharp bark that held no humor, only disbelief. "You're unbelievable." No, I thought, my gaze steady on his, not in me. Later that night, I sat alone in the cavernous gloom of the garage. I hadn't bothered to turn on the lights, preferring the dim, ambient glow filtering in from the open door, painting the empty space where the Mustang had once lived in a wash of melancholy gray. I could still see it perfectly in my mind's eye, the faint familiar crack in the dashboard, a tiny spiderweb of memory. The way the driver's seat leaned ever so slightly to the left, molded by decades of my father's weight. The unmistakable scent of old leather engine oil, and something else, something indefinable that was uniquely him. His presence, an invisible comforting shroud, had lingered there, and now even that was gone. Sold for $80,000, as if it held no more meaning than a used appliance. Sleep was a fleeting, mocking illusion that night. My mind, a frantic kaleidoscope, wouldn't settle. Memories spiraled, each one sharper, more poignant than the last. Driving with him when I was 16, my hands clamped onto the wheel in a white-knuckled grip while he calmly instructed, "Ease up, Emily, the car isn't fighting you." The exhilarating thrill of the first time. He let me drive it alone, the world a blur of freedom. The last time we rode together, just weeks before he got sick before the diagnosis. He hadn't said much that day, just sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. At one point, he reached over his hand briefly, tapping the dashboard, a soft, almost imperceptible gesture. "Take care of it," he'd said. I had nodded, my heart full, meaning every fiber of that promise. The next morning, the hollow feeling was back, a dull ache beneath my ribs. I made coffee, the same strong black brew my dad favored, and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the quiet creaks and sighs of the house settling around me. Alex was already gone, of course. No note, no conversation, just another silent disappearance like always. Around noon, my phone rang, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I almost didn't answer. Habit. My finger hovered over the ignore button. "Hello, ma'am. Is this Emily Carter?" My name, formal and unfamiliar, spoken by a stranger, was jarring. "Yes, this is. My name is Mark from Riverside Auto Group. I believe we recently processed a vehicle connected to your family." My stomach muscles tightened into a knot. I knew instantly. The Mustang. I said, my voice barely a whisper. A brief pause stretched, laden with unspoken meaning. "Yes, ma'am." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "What about it?" Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice dropped, a hushed reverence entering his tone. "Ma'am, your father left something inside the vehicle. Something we just found during our inspection." I sat up straighter, every nerve suddenly alive. "What kind of something?" "I think it's best if you come in, ma'am. You'll want to see this in person." I stared at my phone long after the call ended. For a long moment, I didn't move, rooted to the spot by a surge of inexplicable certainty. Somehow, despite everything, despite the betrayal, the loss, the emptiness, it felt as though my dad was still reaching through the veil, still guiding, still orchestrating. Like he knew, like he had planned this. And for the first time since I'd returned home, that hollow feeling began to shift. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was different. It felt like something unfinished, something profound was waiting for me. I grabbed my keys, the metal cold and solid in my trembling hand, and headed for the door. The drive to Riverside Auto Group took about 25 minutes. I remember every mile of it, not because the road itself was particularly remarkable. It was just a familiar stretch of county highway, lined with the usual old gas stations, sun-faded billboards, and diners that hadn't updated their decor since the 1980s. The kind of places my dad used to point out, imparting his wisdom on which served the best coffee or offered the worst service. But that morning, I barely registered any of it. My hands remained tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my mind a relentless carousel of the same question. What could he have left behind that no one, not even Alex, found until now? The dealership sat just outside town, an immaculate, well-organized expanse of gleaming chrome and polished floors. The kind of place that quietly exuded pride in its reputation, a quiet competence my father would have respected. I parked, stepped out, and for a long moment, I simply stood there breathing in the scent of exhaust and new car smell. Part of me wasn't ready, not for the answers, not for whatever profound truth waited inside those glass doors, but I had spent too many years under my father's exacting roof to ever walk away from something unfinished. So I pushed open the door and stepped inside. A man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and an impeccably pressed shirt approached me almost immediately. His posture was ramrod straight, the kind that silently proclaimed a deep seriousness about his work. "Miss Carter," he inquired, his voice a smooth professional baritone. I nodded, unable to fully articulate the turmoil swirling within me. "Mark," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming in." His grip was firm, respectful, unhurried. My father's words, a quiet echo from the past, surfaced unbidden. "You can tell a lot about a man by his handshake," he used to say. I found myself repeating it aloud without thinking. "My father used to say you can tell a lot about a man by his handshake." Mark offered a small, knowing smile. "Then I hope I made a decent first impression." "You did." There was a pause, brief but remarkably meaningful. He seemed to grasp that this was no routine customer visit. "Come with me," he said, turning. He led me through a quiet side hallway, past a row of bustling offices and the organized chaos of the service bays, until we reached a more secluded area in the back. And then I saw it, the Mustang. It sat bathed in the bright, unforgiving glow of the overhead lights, freshly cleaned, polished, to a near-perfect sheen, almost glowing with an inner light. For a split second, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, exactly as I remembered it. The same deep navy paint reflecting the light like a deep ocean. The same strong, steady lines that had defined its character. The same quiet, commanding presence. It looked cared for, respected, cherished, a fact that surprisingly mattered to me more than I could have anticipated. I stepped closer, almost afraid to touch it, as if my touch might shatter the fragile moment. But then I did, running my hand lightly along the cool, smooth curve of the hood. "Still solid," I whispered, a tremor in my voice. Mark remained a few steps back, granting me a respectful space to reconnect with the ghost of my past. "He took very good care of it," he said softly. "Yes," I replied, my throat tight. "He did." After a moment, I turned back to him, my gaze fixed on his. "You said he left something inside?" Mark nodded, his expression serious. "We didn't catch it at first. It was hidden intentionally." That word intentionally landed with the weight of a stone. A deliberate act. My father. "Where?" He gestured toward the driver's side door. "Under the dash. There's a small panel. Most people wouldn't notice it." I opened the car door. The familiar, comforting creak of the hinge hit me like a rush of memories, a sound that had punctuated countless moments of my life. For a second, I simply stood there, breathing it all, in the worn leather of the steering wheel, the faint, indelible scent of time, and my father, the quiet, immense weight of everything this car had witnessed. Then, following Mark's subtle direction, I leaned down. And there it was, precisely where he indicated, a small compartment, subtle, expertly integrated, easy to miss, unless you knew exactly where to look. My dad knew. Of course he did. Mark handed me a small, unassuming envelope. "We didn't open it," he said. "Figured it was meant for you." I took it, my fingers brushing against his, the paper feeling strangely heavy. My name was scrawled across the front, in his unmistakable handwriting, steady, precise, utterly my father. My chest tightened, a sharp, sudden pang of grief. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I simply held it, feeling its presence, its weight. Because once I did, I knew there would be no turning back. "Take your time," Mark said quietly, his voice a gentle reassurance. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. Then finally, with a deep, bracing breath, I unfolded the flap. Inside, nestled beneath a carefully folded letter, was something else. A small, worn, Navy SEAL coin, its edges smoothed by countless hours of handling. I recognized it instantly. He used to carry it everywhere, he'd once told me, a silent talisman, a reminder of who he was even after the uniform had come off and the battles were fought. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the crisp paper. The elegant script of his handwriting stared back at me.
Emily.
If you're reading this, then things didn't go the way I hoped.
I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. I knew even then that he had expected something like this. His foresight was legendary.
I taught you and your brother the same things. Not because I believed you were the same, but because I believed you both deserved the same chance to do right. Life doesn't always work out that way. I paused, my vision blurring slightly as I fought back the sudden welling of tears. Mark remained silent behind me, a steady, respectful presence. That car isn't just metal, you know that. It carried more than miles. It carried lessons. Time mistakes second chances. I left it to you because you understand the weight of things. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the words resonating with a profound truth that settled deep in my bones. I kept reading. If it's gone, then something went wrong. And if your brother had a hand in it, don't be too quick to hate him. That line stopped me cold, freezing the anger that had been simmering just beneath the surface. Not because I agreed with the sentiment immediately, but because it sounded so precisely, so perfectly him. Measured, controlled, even now from the grave. He's always been looking for something he didn't know how to earn. That doesn't make him a bad man, but it does mean he'll make bad choices. What matters is what you do next. Not to get even, but to make it right. I exhaled slowly, a long, ragged breath. That was my father. No call for revenge, no incitement to anger, just a simple, unyielding demand for responsibility. At the very bottom of the letter, a single concise line. Check the title. I frowned slightly, the words a quiet echo in the stillness of the garage. Check the title, I murmured more to myself than to Mark. He stepped closer, his gaze inquisitive. What is it? I looked up at him, a sudden chilling realization dawning on me. I think my father knew this might happen. Mark nodded slowly, a knowing glint in his eyes. Wouldn't be the first time I've seen something like that. What do you mean? He folded his arms lightly, his posture suggesting a careful choice of words. Sometimes people leave things arranged. Paperwork, ownership details, protections. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. You might want to verify how that car was legally transferred. The words settled in slowly, carefully, like the intricate pieces of a puzzle finally starting to click into place. I looked back at the Mustang gleaming under the bright lights, then at the letter clutched in my hands, then at the small, worn Navy SEAL coin. My dad hadn't just left me a message. He hadn't just left me a car. He had left me a plan. And suddenly this wasn't just about loss anymore. It was about truth, about what was rightfully mine, and about a brother who in his impulsive carelessness might not have understood the true magnitude of what he had actually done. I folded the letter, carefully slipped the coin back into its envelope, then turned to Mark, a new resolve hardening my expression. I need copies of everything related to that sale. His expression remained unchanged, but there was a quiet, almost approving respect in his eyes now.
I figured you might.
As I walked out of the dealership, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt, something profound had shifted inside me. The grief was still there, a dull ache, a constant companion. The anger, too, still simmered beneath the surface. But now it had direction, purpose. My brother thought he had merely sold a car. What he had really sold was something he never fully understood. And I was about to find out exactly how far that monumental mistake went.
I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I sat in the parking lot, the engine off the envelope, resting lightly on my lap. The letter was folded neatly again, tucked back into its paper casing. But it didn't feel closed. Not really. It felt active, alive, as if it had opened something within me that would not be shut back down. Check the title. That single line stayed with me, simple, direct, utterly unambiguous, exactly how my father spoke, when something truly mattered. I had learned a long time ago, through countless quiet lessons, never to ignore instructions like that, especially from him. I pulled out my phone and called the county clerk's office. It wasn't complicated. Small-town systems rarely are. After a few transfers and a short tinny wait, I was speaking to a woman named Linda, whose voice carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who had been working in that office for decades.
I need to verify the title history of a vehicle. I said, my voice steady. It was recently sold, a 1968 Mustang. She asked for the VIN. Luckily, Mark had had the foresight to give me a copy of the dealership paperwork before I left. There was a brief pause as she typed, then another longer one. Her tone when she spoke again shifted ever so slightly. Well, now, she said, her voice quieter, a hint of surprise in it. That's interesting. I felt my back straighten, every muscle tensing. What is it? Another pause, thick with anticipation. This vehicle, she finally said, her words measured, it wasn't solely owned by your brother. My grip tightened around the phone, my knuckles white. A sudden jolt of electricity shot through me. It couldn't have been. It was my father's. Yes, ma'am. And according to this, your father placed the title under a joint structure before he passed.
My heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer against my ribs.
Joint with who? I breathed, almost afraid of the answer. With you.
For a moment, I didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even breathe. The world seemed to hold its breath with me.
That means, Linda continued gently, her voice cutting through the ringing silence. Any sale of the vehicle would have required your signature as well. I stared out through the windshield, but I wasn't seeing the bustling parking lot anymore. I was seeing my father standing in the dim light of the garage, his hand extending, pressing those heavy keys into my palm. You'll understand someday. And if it didn't, I asked quietly, the question barely audible. If your signature wasn't present, she said, choosing her words with careful precision, then the sale may not have been legally valid. There it was. Clear, simple, unequivocal, just like him. Thank you, I said, the words feeling profound. Of course, honey, she replied, a hint of maternal warmth in her voice. You might want to talk to a lawyer.
I ended the call and set the phone down. My hands, which had been trembling just moments before, were strangely steady now. Uncannily so, because something had shifted again, profoundly and irrevocably. Up until that moment, I had been grappling with grief with a white-hot anger, with the kind of deep, pervasive hurt that settles in and doesn't easily move. But this was different. This was structure. This was right and wrong. This was something concrete, something I could act on. My father hadn't just left me a message. He had left me protection. And suddenly I understood with startling clarity what he had meant by make it right. I didn't go home, not yet. Instead, I turned the key in the ignition and drove straight to my brother's place. He lived across town in a newer development, a meticulously planned neighborhood of cookie-cutter houses, small manicured lawns, and cars that looked leased rather than owned. The kind of place that tried so very hard to project an image of effortless stability. I parked in his driveway, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment, letting the silence of the car settle around me, composing myself. Then I got out. He opened the door before I even knocked, as if he'd been expecting me, his casual posture, a thin veneer over something I couldn't quite name. Hey, he said, his voice as nonchalant as ever. You look intense. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, my gaze unwavering. We need to talk. He sighed, a familiar gesture of theatrical exasperation. About the car again. Yes. He shut the door behind me. The sound wasn't there echoing as the ein. Nice. Yeah. What? It's so what so for but it's fees what. Menali the city was say. Look, I already told you. You didn't have the right to sell it. That stopped him just for a second. His practiced shrug faltered. Then he recovered, a flash of irritation in his eyes. There it is, he said, throwing his hands up. Back to that. It wasn't yours. It was Dad's, he snapped, his voice rising raw with defensiveness. And Dad's gone. The words, sharp and cutting, hit harder than he probably intended. But I didn't react. Not emotionally. Not this time. My voice remained calm, steady, unwavering. Did you sign the title? I asked. He frowned slightly, confusion warring with irritation. What? The paperwork. Did you sign it? Yeah, obviously. Did I? That pause again. Longer this time. The casual indifference slowly leaching from his face. What are you getting at? He asked, a subtle edge of suspicion creeping into his voice. I held his gaze, refusing to waver. The car wasn't just in your name. Silence, heavy and absolute. It was jointly owned, I continued, my voice even, with me. His expression shifted, a complex alchemy of emotions playing across his features. Confusion first, then a flash of disbelief, then something tighter, a dawning comprehension that was almost pain. That doesn't make sense. It does, I said calmly, and it means you sold something you didn't fully own. He laughed then, a hollow, humorless sound that didn't land right, brittle as shattered glass. You're serious? Yes. That's not how it works. It is exactly how it works. The room felt smaller, now quieter. Even the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with unspoken truths. You're saying the sale wasn't valid? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'm saying you didn't have the legal right to make it alone. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture. That's not what the dealership said. They wouldn't know, I countered, unless you told them.
Another silence, this one longer, deeper, filled with the unspoken weight of his actions.
You're going to undo it, I said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a demand. Just a simple, unwavering statement of fact. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek.
You don't get to just walk in here and... I'm not here to fight. I said, cutting him off, and I meant it. That was the crucial difference now. I'm here to fix something that should have never happened.
He looked at me then, really looked, truly seeing me for the first time since I'd come home. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not dismissal, but doubt. Raw, unvarnished doubt. What if I can't? He asked, the question coming out quieter than I expected, more honest, laced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. I took a slow, deep breath, then answered him just as calmly, my voice soft but firm. Then we figure it out.
Because this wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about proving him wrong or punishing him. It wasn't even truly about the car itself. It was about restoring something that had been broken, something my father had tried right up until the very end to hold together. Family.
I turned toward the door, the quiet resolve solid within me.
We're going back to the dealership tomorrow, I said.
He didn't argue, didn't agree either. He just stood there, processing the weight of the revelation settling heavily upon him. And as I stepped outside, into the softening light of the late afternoon, I realized something else. This wasn't going to be easy. Not legally, not emotionally. But for the first time since I had returned home, lost and adrift, I wasn't lost anymore. I had a direction, a purpose, and I was going to see it through. The next morning came slower than usual. Not because time itself had altered its pace, but because everything felt heavier, more deliberate, as if each step now carried a weight and significance it hadn't before. I woke early out of habit, the house quiet just as it always was. But the quiet no longer felt hollow. It felt expectant, waiting. I made coffee the way my dad used to, strong, unsweetened with just a splash of milk. He used to quip, "If you need to dress it up, Emily, it probably wasn't good to begin with." I allowed myself a faint smile at the memory. Small things like that had a way of sticking, of weaving themselves into the fabric of who you were.
By the time Alex showed up, I was already dressed ready. He looked tired, not physically as if he hadn't slept, but something in his posture had shifted. Less casual, less certain. You ready? I asked, my voice flat. He nodded once, a brief, tight movement.
Yeah. No sarcasm, no dismissive shrug, just quiet. We drove separately to the dealership. I don't think either of us said it out loud, but we both understood the need for that space, that silent separation. Time to think, time to process, time to step into something we couldn't take back.
When we arrived, Mark was already waiting. He greeted us with the same steady, respectful demeanor he had shown me the day before, but his eyes, I noticed, flicked briefly to Alex, a subtle flicker of assessment of understanding. "Good to see you again," he said, his gaze returning to me. "You too," I replied, and gestured slightly toward my brother. "This is him." Mark gave a small formal nod. "Sir." Alex nodded back a little stiffly, his usual easy charm nowhere to be found. We didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mark led us back to the same quiet area in the back, and there it was again. The Mustang still glowing under the bright lights. I glanced back at Alex. He looked confused, his brow furrowed as Mark indicated the small, cleverly hidden compartment under the dash. "Dad did this?" he asked, his voice barely audible, a note of genuine surprise. "Yes," I said, "because of course he did." I opened the compartment. Inside was a small metal box, old and scratched, but clearly well cared for and locked. Mark handed me a key. "We found this taped inside the glove compartment," he explained. I took the key, turning it over in my hand. My father had planned every single detail. The lock clicked open with a soft final sound, a small release of tension. Inside, nestled carefully, were photographs, dozens of them. I picked one up. It was old, faded slightly at the edges, capturing my dad in his Navy uniform, impossibly young, standing proudly beside the Mustang when it was still new, gleaming. The next photo, me perhaps 8 years old, perched on the hood, a wide, gap-toothed grin on my face. Another Alex as a teenager, arms crossed, trying a little too hard to look cool, but a faint, undeniable smile playing on his lips. I felt something shift in my chest. Not sharp, not painful, just a deep, profound ache that bordered on tenderness. "Keep going," Mark said quietly, sensing the emotional weight of the moment. Beneath the photographs were more documents carefully folded, protected in a clear plastic sleeve. I opened the first one, title paperwork, original, then updated, then revised again. I skimmed quickly, then slowed, then stopped because there it was clear as day. Transfer of ownership. From my father to me, not shared, not partial, complete. My breath caught in my throat. That's not. Alex started, his voice thick with disbelief. But I kept reading. There had been an earlier version, indeed showing joint ownership. But the final revision, it had been changed, signed, notarized, and filed, all before he passed. I looked up slowly, my gaze sweeping from the document to Alex, then to Mark.
He changed it. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable.
It happens sometimes. People update things late. Alex stepped closer now, his eyes wide fixed on the paper in my hands.
Let me see.
I handed him the document. He scanned it faster than I had, his gaze darting across the lines as if he didn't want to fully absorb the crushing reality. This doesn't make sense. It does, I said, my voice soft but firm. He never told me. He didn't tell me either. That part mattered, because it meant something. My father hadn't wanted a fight. He hadn't wanted confrontation. He had simply made a decision, a quiet, deliberate act, and trusted time to reveal it. There was one more document in the box, a second letter, shorter, more direct. I unfolded it, my hands steady now, a quiet certainty settling within me.
Emily, if you're holding this, then things went further than I hoped. The car is yours, not because you earned it more, but because you understood it. Your brother, he's still learning.
I paused, my eyes flicking up to Alex. He was watching me now, truly watching, his usual defenses, stripped away, a raw vulnerability in his gaze.
Don't use this to punish him. Use it to remind him. Some things aren't meant to be taken. They're meant to be carried.
I exhaled slowly. That was it. No signature, no extra words. He didn't need them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, on top of the photographs and the title, A New Testament. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the garage was heavy, but it was a silence filled with understanding, with unspoken truths.
Then Alex said quietly, his voice raspy, barely a whisper, I didn't know.
I believed him, not because he necessarily deserved my belief, but because I could hear the raw honesty in his tone, the genuine shock. You didn't ask, I replied. Not harsh, not accusatory, just honest.
He nodded slightly, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that he knew it was true. Mark stepped in gently, his voice breaking the spell.
Legally, he said, this changes things.
We both looked at him, waiting.
The sale may be reversible. Mark's pronouncement hung in the air, a delicate, almost fragile thread of hope in the sterile office. The implications were immediate, stark. Heavy, real, I murmured, the weight of the words settling deep within me. This wasn't just a legal loophole, it was a moral reckoning. My brother, who moments before had seemed resigned, let out a slow, shuddering breath, a sound that spoke of a pressure finally beginning to ease. This is a mess. He confessed, the words tinged with a weary helplessness I hadn't heard from him before. Yes, I said, my voice steady, despite the tremor of relief coursing through me. It is, but it wasn't chaos anymore. It was still complicated, deeply inconvenient, perhaps even painful, but it was no longer formless panic. It had begun to take on shape, a direction, a difficult, inconvenient truth. And standing there, surrounded by the echoes of my father's life, the ghost of his car, the silent power of his final words, the tangible evidence of everything he had left behind, I realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't simply about reclaiming a vehicle, a piece of metal and leather. This was about something far larger, ensuring that the quiet integrity, the steadfast principles, the very essence of what he stood for, wasn't lost along with it. We didn't leave the dealership right away. The gravity of the situation demanded more than a hasty exit.
No one rushed us. That was something I'd noticed about moments that truly mattered. They rarely moved at a frantic pace. Instead, they settled in, took their time, insisted you feel every facet of their impact. Mark, shedding his salesman persona entirely, guided us into a small, unassuming office just off the main floor. His movements were deliberate, his expression serious. The room was nothing fancy, far from the polished glint of the showroom. A functional desk, a couple of worn institutional chairs, and a coffee machine in the corner that looked like a relic from another era, its chrome dulled by countless brews. It reminded me instinctively of the quiet, understated places my dad used to frequent. Small, unpretentious rooms where important decisions were made, often without a lot of fanfare or noise. Mark closed the door gently, the soft click sealing us in the outside world, fading to a muffled hum.
Let's go over where things stand, he said, his voice low and devoid of any sales pitch. He sounded less like a car dealer and more like someone genuinely trying to navigate a complex situation with integrity, striving to do right by all sides. I sat down first, my posture still, my mind already running through scenarios. My brother followed slower this time, his usual bravado utterly absent. I'd never seen him look quite so unsure of himself.
Mark laid the paperwork across the desk, a stack of forms and legal documents that suddenly seemed to hold the weight of our family's future.
The vehicle was sold under your brother's signature. He stated, his gaze meeting mine directly, acknowledging my earlier questions. But based on what we just reviewed, he didn't have full legal authority to complete that sale. He paused, letting the implications sink in, then shifted his focus to my brother. That puts us in a complicated position. My brother rubbed his face, a gesture of deep weariness and frustration. The single word he uttered was almost a whisper. Complicated. How my brother's voice was sharp, a sudden crack in his quietude.
Mark leaned back slightly, his expression sympathetic but firm.
Well, legally speaking, the sale could be challenged, potentially voided.
Meaning, my brother pressed the fear of the unknown, tightening his jaw. Meaning, Mark clarified, the buyer could be required to return the vehicle.
A heavy silence descended thick with the weight of that possibility. But Mark wasn't finished. That doesn't happen cleanly, he continued, breaking the quiet. There are contracts, payments, third parties involved. It's rarely a simple reversal. Of course there are, my brother muttered, a cynical edge returning to his voice.
I stayed quiet, letting Mark's words settle, letting the implications unwind in my mind. That was something the Navy had drilled into me early, a fundamental lesson that had saved me countless times. Don't speak until you understand the situation fully. Mark turned to me, his eyes conveying the gravity of his next statement.
If you pursue this formally, it becomes a legal matter. Attorney's court's time. How much time, I asked, cutting straight to the practical reality. The thought of endless legal battles was exhausting. He shrugged slightly, a small, weary gesture. Months, maybe longer. I nodded, absorbing the news. That made sense. Nothing truly worth fixing ever came easy. And the buyer, I asked, knowing this detail would be crucial.
Mark hesitated for a beat, choosing his words carefully.
Older gentleman, local veteran.
That landed with a quiet thump in the room. Of course he was. It almost felt preordained. He knew what he was buying, I asked, needing to understand if this was an innocent mistake or something more predatory.
Yes, Mark confirmed.
He appreciated the car, asked about its history. Your father's name came up. I looked down at the polished surface of the table. My dad's name. Even in his absence, it still carried an immense weight, a silent testament to a life lived with honor.
Even now, he didn't do anything wrong, Mark added, anticipating my thoughts. From his perspective, everything was legitimate. I know I said, and I meant it. This wasn't about punishing an innocent man.
My brother shifted restlessly in his chair, his patience wearing thin.
So what, he just gives it back?
Mark shook his head slightly, a subtle but firm refusal.
Not just like that.
I leaned forward, my hands on my knees, ready to confront the complexities.
What are the options?
Mark folded his hands on the desk, his gaze steady.
We can reach out to him, explain the situation, present the documentation.
And then I asked, prompting him for the next step.
Then we see how he responds. Fair enough, I conceded. My brother let out a short, incredulous breath. This is unbelievable.
I turned to him, my gaze unwavering.
Is it? He looked at me. Really looked this time? Not with the usual defensiveness or the quick anger, but with something new and raw uncertainty.
I didn't know, he said again, his voice barely audible. I know, I replied, my voice softer now. It didn't erase anything, the damage he'd done, the trust he'd broken. But his admission, his vulnerability, it mattered.
Mark stood, breaking the charged quiet. I can make the call, he offered, but I think it would mean more if you were both there. I nodded a silent agreement.
Let's do it. My brother hesitated for a moment, then nodded too. A small, almost imperceptible dip of his head. Mark stepped out to make the arrangements, leaving the two of us alone in the small office. The room felt quieter now, not tense, but honest, laid bare.
You really would have waited? My brother asked suddenly, his voice thin, almost fragile. For me to get back?
I didn't answer right away.
Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted him to hear it, to truly feel the weight of it. Yes, I said.
He looked down, nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his eyes.
I didn't think about it like that. I know. Another pause stretched between us. I thought, he started, then trailed off, struggling to find the words. Thought what I prompted gently. He shrugged slightly, a vestige of his old deflection, but this time it felt different. Thought it was just sitting there.
That word again. Just the dismissive, diminishing word that had caused so much of this.
It wasn't, I said quietly, firmly. He nodded, meeting my gaze. I see that now. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I believed him. Truly believed he understood.
Mark came back a few minutes later holding his phone.
He's available this afternoon, he said. He said we could come by.
That was quicker than I expected, a testament to Walter Hayes' willingness to engage.
Good, I said, standing. We gathered the documents, the letters, the heavy wooden box, everything my father had left behind, now imbued with renewed significance. As we walked out, I glanced back once more at the Mustang gleaming silently in the showroom. Still sitting there, still steady. It hadn't gone anywhere. Not really. And somehow that felt like exactly the kind of thing my father would have planned. The drive to the buyer's house was quiet, reflective. My brother followed behind me. This time, his truck holding a respectful distance. No racing ahead, no reckless shortcuts, just steady, measured progress. The house was nestled about 15 minutes outside town, a comfortable distance from the bustle of the dealership. It was an older home, meticulously well kept, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a vibrant American flag proudly displayed by the porch. A set of hand tools was lined up with military precision along the side of the garage, each in its place. My dad, I thought, would have approved implicitly of this man's home. We parked, stepped out of our respective vehicles, and walked up the gravel driveway together, a united front. Mark knocked. A moment later, the door opened.
The man standing there was clearly in his 70s, with a strong, upright posture and clear, discerning eyes. The kind of presence you don't fake. He took one look at us, then at the folder in my hands, and nodded slowly, a profound understanding already etched on his face.
Come on in, he said, his voice deep and calm. No surprise, no confusion, just immediate quiet understanding. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be a fight, a bitter legal battle. It was going to be something else entirely, something my father would have respected deeply. The man introduced himself as Walter Hayes. His voice was steady, the kind that came from years of saying only what truly needed to be said, not sharp, not overly soft, just grounded and clear. Have a seat, he said, gesturing toward the living room. We stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of wood polish and rich brewed coffee, a comforting, timeless scent. The furniture was older, substantial, but impeccably kept. Nothing flashy, nothing out of place. Each piece speaking of careful use and lasting quality. Photographs lined the walls, military portraits stoic and proud, interspersed with warm, candid family shots. It was the kind of life that had been lived with intention, with purpose. My father, I knew, would have respected that profoundly. Walter didn't rush us. He sat across from us, his hands resting lightly on his knees, an aura of quiet anticipation about him. I figured this might happen, he said, his gaze unwavering. His words caught me off guard. You did? I asked, surprised by his foresight.
He nodded.
Not the details, he clarified, but something about that car. He glanced toward the window, as if he could see the Mustang gleaming in the driveway, even from inside the house. It had a story.
I felt my grip tighten slightly on the folder, a silent affirmation.
It does.
Mark stepped in gently, ready to transition to the formal explanation.
Mr. Hayes, we've uncovered some documentation that changes the ownership structure. Walter raised a hand, a calm gesture that nonetheless commanded attention. Before you show me anything, he said, his eyes returning to mine, I'd like to hear it from her. He wasn't impatient, just direct, seeking the personal truth before the legal one.
So I told him, not everything. Not the full raw weight of the last few days, but enough about my father, about the Mustang, about the letter, about the title transfer clause. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse anyone, didn't dramatize it. I simply told the truth plainly and without embellishment. When I finished, the room stayed quiet, the unspoken emotion heavy in the air. Walter leaned back slightly in his armchair, taking it all in his gaze, thoughtful. Then he nodded slowly.
Sounds like your father was a thoughtful man.
He was, I said, my voice thick with pride and lingering grief. Walter looked at my brother next, a silent invitation, a moment of reckoning.
And you? My brother shifted uncomfortably. For a second, I thought he might deflect, make a joke to lighten the mood, or shrug it off like he had so many times before. But he didn't. He met Walter's steady gaze, and then, with a quiet strength I hadn't seen in him until now, he simply said,
I messed up.
Simple, clear, no excuses. Walter studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. A gesture that was neither approval nor dismissal, but pure acknowledgement. That happens. Mark then handed Walter the documents. He took them, adjusted his glasses slightly on the bridge of his nose, and began to read through everything carefully. No rushing, no skipping pages, his veteran's focus absolute. The room stayed quiet while he did the only sound, the faint rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, marking the passage of time of truth unfolding.
After a few minutes, he set the papers down on a small side table.
Well, he said, looking at me, his voice still calm. Legally, it looks like you're right. The car wasn't his to sell. My brother exhaled slowly, a long, drawn-out sound, as if hearing it spoken aloud made the abstract reality concrete.
That puts me in an interesting position, Walter continued, his tone devoid of any self-pity.
I nodded, feeling a surge of empathy for him. I understand, and I did. This wasn't his mistake, his responsibility. He tapped the papers lightly. I paid $80,000 for that car. Fair price given what I knew at the time.
That makes sense, I said, acknowledging the integrity of his purchase. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding a distant look.
I didn't buy it to flip it. Didn't buy it to show it off in some parade.
Another glance toward the window, a quiet connection to the car outside.
I bought it because it reminded me of something. I waited, sensing a deeper revelation coming. My first deployment, he said, his voice soft with memory. Different time, different war, but the same feeling. He paused, lost in thought. Came home and bought a car just like that. Not because I needed it, but because it meant something. It was a marker, a promise.
I understood that far more than I had expected to. The profound, often inexpressible connection between a returning veteran and a vehicle that represented freedom, a new beginning, a hard-won peace. Walter looked back at me, his gaze direct.
So here's the question, he said. What does it mean to you?
I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it right to convey the full weight of its significance.
It's not just a car, I said, my voice carefully measured. It's the last thing my father trusted me with, his final instruction.
Walter nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes.
That's what I thought. Another quiet moment passed, steeped in shared understanding. Then he leaned back again, making his decision.
Well, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his convictions. I'm not interested in keeping something that wasn't meant to be mine.
My brother looked up quickly, his head snapping toward Walter. I felt something in my chest loosen, a profound relief washing over me, but Walter wasn't finished. That said, he continued, his tone practical. I'm not in the habit of losing $80,000 either. Fair. Completely fair. I wouldn't expect you to, I said, immediately acknowledging his right to protect his investment. He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod, a faint smile touching the corners of his lips. So here's what we're going to do. The room seemed to settle, the air growing still with anticipation.
You buy it back, he stated simply. Same price I paid.
I blinked, surprised by the straightforward generosity of the offer. That's it.
Walter's faint smile widened slightly.
That's it. No markup, no leverage, no advantage taken, just fair.
My brother spoke up, his practical anxieties resurfacing. I don't have that kind of money.
Walter looked at him, his expression unwavering. I didn't ask if you did.
Silence. A profound, uncomfortable silence that settled heavily on my brother. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, knowing what I had to do.
I can cover it, I said, my voice steady.
My brother turned toward me, his face etched with concern, perhaps even shame.
You shouldn't have to. I'm not doing it for you. I said, my voice not harsh, but clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I was doing it because it mattered. It was for my father, for his legacy, for the principle of it.
Walter nodded, a silent endorsement of my decision.
That's your choice. I looked down at the papers on the table, then back up at him, a deep well of gratitude in my eyes. Thank you, I said, truly meaning it.
He waved it off lightly, a humble gesture.
Your father did the hard part, he said. I'm just making sure it lands where it should. That sounded exactly like something my dad would have said. We stood and Walter extended his hand. This time, when his strong, calloused fingers gripped mine, I felt it. That same quiet strength, that same profound understanding passing between us like a silent current. Outside, the afternoon light felt different. Softer, somehow less harsh, as if the world itself had found a moment of peace. My brother stood beside me, unusually quiet, processing the unexpected resolution.
After a moment, he spoke, his voice low.
I didn't think it would go like this. Neither did I replied, a small smile touching my lips. Another pause, then he turned to me, his gaze firm. I'll pay you back. I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for sincerity. Then start by showing up, I said. He nodded a quiet agreement, a new understanding settling between us, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.
We got back in our respective cars, heading back toward the dealership, toward the Mustang, toward something that had almost been irrevocably lost but wasn't. Because some things aren't meant to be taken, they're meant to be carried.
The day I brought the Mustang home, I didn't say much. There wasn't a need for it. Some moments don't call for words, they just ask you to be present, to absorb the weight of them. The engine started the same way it always had, with a low, steady rumble, a familiar, certain sound, like it had been patiently waiting for me. I rested my hands on the wheel for a second before pulling out of the dealership lot, the worn leather soft and welcoming in all the right places, not damaged, not simply aged, but lived in and fused with history. As I drove, memories didn't rush in like a torrent as they often had before. They came slower now, gentler, like they had finally settled into their rightful place, no longer demanding, but simply present.
My father in the passenger seat, quiet but watchful, his hand tapping the dashboard when I took a turn too fast. The way he never raised his voice, but somehow you still corrected yourself, understanding the unspoken lesson. Take care of it. I understood that now. Not just the car, everything. When I pulled into the driveway, I parked it in the same spot it had always occupied. Engine off, silence. But this time the silence didn't feel empty or heavy with grief. It felt full, full of presence, full of meaning. I sat there for a while, just breathing, letting the moment imprint itself. Then I stepped out, walked around it. One slow, deliberate, a quiet ritual of reconnection. The house looked the same, the street felt the same. Nothing had physically changed, and yet everything had. My brother showed up later that afternoon. He didn't text, didn't call. He just showed up quietly parking his truck down the street. That I realized mattered profoundly. He stood at the edge of the driveway for a long moment, looking at the Mustang, then at me.
You got it back, he said, his voice laced with surprise and a hint of something fragile, hopeful.
I did. He nodded slowly, letting the reality sink in.
I didn't think you would.
I didn't think I would either. We stood there for a while, the car between us, not as a barrier, but as a silent witness. No tension, no raised voices, just quiet, shared space. Then he walked closer, his hand reaching out to run, along the cool, smooth side of the car the same way I had.
I remember this, he said, a wistful note in his voice.
I know.
Another pause longer this time, filled with unspoken things. I was a kid, he continued, his gaze distant. Dad used to take us out on Sundays. Just drive. No reason. I smiled faintly, a shared memory surfacing. Yeah. He never talked much, my brother reflected. No, I replied. He didn't, but you always knew what he meant.
That was the truth of it, the essence of our father's communication.
I should have called you, he said, his confession raw. Yes, I should have asked. Yes, I didn't.
No, I agreed softly, acknowledging his self-assessment. He nodded, accepting it, not arguing, not explaining it away.
I was thinking about money, he said, his gaze dropping. About pressure, about everything I didn't have figured out. I listened, letting him speak his truth. And I told myself it didn't matter. He continued, his voice softer, almost ashamed, that it was just sitting there. That word again, just the dismissive word that had haunted us. It wasn't, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I know that now, he replied, meeting my gaze. We stood there, the car between us, not as a barrier separating us, but as something shared, a tangible link to our past and a potential bridge to our future. I'm going to pay you back, he said, his voice firm with renewed resolve.
I shook my head slightly.
That's not the point. He frowned, genuinely confused.
Then what is...
I took a breath, looked at the Mustang, then back at him, letting the weight of my father's lessons guide my words.
The point is you don't do it again.
He nodded, a quiet understanding dawning. Not with this, I continued my gaze steady. Not with anything. Another nod stronger this time, a deeper conviction behind it. I won't. And for the first time, I believed him. Not just because he said the words, but because he understood them, truly grasped the deeper meaning. That I realized was the difference.
We didn't hug. That wasn't us. But something settled between us. Something repaired. Not perfect, not complete, but real.
That evening, I sat out on the porch, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as the air cooled. The Mustang sat in the driveway, quiet, steady, bathed in the fading light. I held the small, heavy seal coin in my hand, turning it over slowly, feeling its cool metal against my palm. My father had carried this through everything, war, loss, life, and now it was here in my hand, a tangible piece of his resilience.
I thought about everything that had happened in the last few days, the anger, the loss, the hard-won choice to move forward instead of striking back. It would have been so easy to turn it into something else, to make it about punishment, about proving a point. But that wasn't what he taught me. He taught me that what you carry matters more than what you take. That a legacy isn't something you sell or something you simply inherit. It's something you live up to, something you honor. And sometimes it's something you have to protect fiercely, even from your own family. I looked out at the car one more time, then down at the coin in my hand.
Got it, I said quietly, the words a silent promise to the man who had taught me so much.
If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you've lost, or something you've been trusted with, take a moment, hold on to it, share it. Because the things that matter most aren't always the things we can replace. And if you believe in stories like this, quiet ones, real ones, you're always welcome here.